Thanks very much, Marianne, for the talk. I imagine there were more questions as well there, so we'll give a decent amount of time for questions from the audience for this. What I wanted to ask both of you to start this is, when we think about policies in social issues like this, there's always these two justifications for the policies. It's the right thing to do, but you'll also do well if you do it. To motivate policy in this, how should we be framing policies around gender? Stefano.
Thank you, Tim, and good afternoon to all of you. Let me start by saying that I really enjoyed your talk, Marianne. I think she said it all.
It was good, wasn't it?
It was fantastic. And let me say also, it's a bit emotional for me to be here because in the amphitheater to Daniel Cohen, I had the pleasure to work with Danielle some time ago. So it feels sort of quite emotional to be here in this room and thinking about it. So is it the right thing to do? I think this is a moral imperative. I mean, we should stop there and not go any further. Of course, I am at OECD, so also we look at the economic aspect of it. Let me just say a few things, because in a few weeks we are releasing our employment outlook, which this year focuses on the impact of demographic changes on our labor market, on our economies. So the bottom line is that on average across the OECD countries, we will lose some 10% of the working age population by 2060. In my own country, we are losing 35% of the working age population. In Korea, more than 40%. So if I take all of that, this means that the dependency rate has already increased 3 times from the 80s to today. By 2060, it will be 50%, meaning that each person of working age who does to sustain herself and pay or provide income for half of the income of someone on retirement. In my country, actually, he or she has to provide 70% of the income of someone on retirement. So if you take these and you assume productivity growth being the same and you project to 2060, it means that the average GDP growth in the OECD country has been in the last full cycle from 2006 to 2019 by 1%, will fall by 40% to 0.6%, okay? So obviously we will grow much less. Now, what if we close the gender gap? Well, half of this drop in GDP per capita can be recovered. So even from a pure economic point of view, I think in an aging context, closing the gender gap is one of the few tools we have to deal with something that is going to happen because, demographic changes are going to happen. It's not like digital, artificial intelligence, or even climate change. The other, of course, tool we have is to use the talent pool of people of older age, which is a bit more difficult, who actually drop out from the labor market after the age of 60. So I think, and I've seen a significant change in the discourse among policymakers, now are fully realizing about the impact of demographic changes, and they seems to be more keen to really consider all the tools they have at their disposal to use all the talent pool we have out there. I mean, my own country, the gap, just in employment between men and women is 17 percentage points. In some region in the south of Italy, the employment rate of women is one third. Yet, in Italy, like in most, actually all of the OECD countries, the girl who graduated from tertiary degree is much higher, 10 percentage point higher than boys. So we have a huge talent pool there that we are really not using. And of course, the range of policies that Marianne presented in her fantastic talk have to be used, all of them. I don't think there is one magic bullet. It's actually a combination of policy, which may have to be adapted to different contexts, but I think have to be used all. I think now the pressure is there. If we don't do that, you're going to be living in an economy, in a society that actually not growing anymore, is growing very little, much less than what we have been seeing over the past decade.
Unless AI takes over, this is like the first day of the conference. But I mean, seriously, I think the conversation on the first day is certainly very relevant to all of this. So if I go with the optimistic tone on the first day of the conference that kind of jobs will remain there, then the considerations that you are bringing are certainly the first order one. I think it's. You said it's a moral issue. I mean, there's obviously different kind of morality. One is just like, kind of fairness and right. And some people kind of think about these issues only via that lens. I think that matters, but I think another consideration is just about, efficiency and growth, kind of that's also a version of, kind of making the pie, as big as possible. And, from that perspective, this is, super important. I think there's a danger in my mind, again, so I think politics is just very much top of mind, and US politics is very much top of mind in this conversation right now. That's just, kind of with all that's happening in the US right now, I feel like people have lost track of the second objective. I think there's a sense that, we are prioritizing, men over women. There's no sense that like improving women's, kind of participation in the workforce is going to be win-win. This kind of zero-sum scenarios where, kind of like my graph on Denmark, if like women improve at men's cost. So I think politically, I think it's particularly important to stress, kind of why we want to do this for efficiency reasons and for growth reasons.
Maybe two caveats on what I said and what Marianne was saying. One is that if we look at the evolution of the labor market, say post-COVID, we have seen something which is quite surprising, which I think is the beginning of the effect of the baby boom leaving the labor market. So we have seen growth not actually decelerating over the past 2 years, and yet employment continued to increase, right? This is surprising. You see economic growth slowing down, then you see employment actually stagnating or actually declining. We have not seen that. Second, the employment rate of women has increased much more than men.
Okay.
So this means that to some extent, and we have a widespread labor shortage across all sectors, not just an issue about the top skill type of job. We have been seeing a sort of labor shortage there for a long time. Labor shortage is widespread. So of course, employers have to be more keen to bring in the talent pool which is out there, even though they were less employed or maybe not employed. The second point is that closing the gender gap, we have to consider also unpaid work. I think this was said through the conference by Marianne. We know that on average across the OECD country, women actually work 2 hours more per day than men if we take paid and unpaid work. So bringing more women into paid work cannot be actually keeping them doing the exact same unpaid work, because this will accumulate to even more hours work altogether, which brings, of course, the behavioral changes, the fact that there should be not only a better sharing of the paid work, but also of the unpaid work. And this, of course, depends on what happens within families and within households.
Yeah, this is something that we learned a lot about during COVID-19, and also during the crisis, during the huge sort of rise in prices recently as well, isn't it? On the other hand, I mean, that information was always there. How much more do we know about this? The idea that across the board housework is not shared equally. How much more did we need to know about this?
I mean, the OECD produces, kind of my go-to statistics on, on these measures.
Yeah.
But I would argue, I mean, we have been producing this statistic for a long time.
Forever, yes.
Yet, I would argue that, I don't know, I would like to ask Marianne about it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how much progress we have made into the perception that unpaid work, care work, and beyond should be better shared between women and men.
Yes, it's one thing having the information to show that it's not equally shared.
It's pretty clear, actually, in some countries like Turkey and Mexico, we're talking about 200 minutes per day of basically extra work provided by women compared to men. Yet, I don't think we have seen massive changes into that. And this, again, has to do with the deep roots of beliefs and actually behavior within the household, within the family.
Yeah, Marianne, does this speak to the limits that information provision can have in changing norms?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I feel like to change norms, you need to see the opposite behavior of the norms, and that become more common. I think this is certainly a much more powerful way to try to change norms. So, you see these information kind of policies making a bit of a difference, but I don't think on their own they're going to take you super far. On the other hand, kind of we have, some of the work that Seema Jayachandran has been doing in the Indian context, which is just, parents matter, schools matter, right? So if you build in within the schooling environment, kind of different views and different beliefs about differences between men and women, that, you know, may have some, you know, some impact. So I don't know whether you count that as information. It's just more like education and bringing this education into, you know, into the education system from an early age.
But also my feedback to what we've been discussing, which is the pay gaps, gender pay gap, and also the occupational segregation. So the perception is that if I'm a man and I earn much more, I work a few more hours, I get a bonus, so the income of the household will increase more if the woman actually spend more time at work instead of spending time at home. So there is also misperception and the stereotype that is unfortunately widespread. And this has to do with the pay gap in the same job, but actually also occupational segregation, whereby of course, women are a little bit segregated in occupation that maybe not offer sort of the opportunity to work extra time and to be rewarded for that in terms of higher wages.
In policy terms, I was quite surprised about the taxation policies, about how they punish women's work. The idea that that should still be around. I understand that that was around for my parents, but the idea that we have hangover policies like this. Are there policies that you would pinpoint that really have no business being in the modern world for either Europe, OECD countries?
This one is really the first other one that comes to mind, and I highlighted it because I feel like I haven't seen as much policy discussion.
It's not talked about very often, is it?
Talk much, you know, much about it. Obviously, I mean, I think it goes hand in hand with very kind of view of the family and the traditional family and the best, you know. These kind of taxation system kind of basically optimize for, you know, the woman stay at home and the man makes all the money. So.
From your point of view?
No, absolutely. I mean, the case that Marianne was presenting of Sweden is actually extremely one of the very clear example of that. Of course, you know, government are somewhat concerned about changing so fundamentally the taxation system, given the fact that they have to make sure that actually the revenue comes. But this is very clear. One thing which I've not seen, but Marianne can probably tell me about it, suppose that it was the woman earning more than the man. Would that be sort of the fact that there's a joint taxation, would that actually discourage the man to work more hours? Or this work only in one sense? So if the woman earned less than the man, then is the woman that somewhat has fewer incentive to work to devote more hours?
Yeah.
Because I wonder that is not symmetrical. That,
yeah, well,
it's just an assumption.
I mean, I think the policy would be symmetric if the woman is a top earner.
Absolutely.
You know, that there would be a higher tax. The question is whether the elasticity of men's work to the tax the same as women. And I think we've seen some evidence of this. I think earlier on today is that the elasticity for women is always higher than it is for men. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that's come up this week has been how early these norms begin, and that trying to correct pay imbalances in your current job cannot take account of a lot of things that have happened before before we came into the job. Again, is policy failing to intervene early enough?
Well, the answer, I think, is no. My wife actually ran a sort of a non-for-profit sort of association. It's called Look at the Sky and Look at the Universe. And actually they teach younger boys and girls in primary and lower secondary school. And one of the questions they ask, do you think you're good in mathematics? And the difference between the boys and the girl is huge, is very large. Many girls say, no, I don't think I'm good at mathematics. So it starts very early, the perception that they are more inclined to a certain kind of field of study and less in STEM. This has to do with what happened within the household, I think teachers, and a lot of things. So I think I fully agree with you, if we want to see a difference in behavior and reduce the stereotypes and the misconception, we should really start much earlier. We can rely on parents, of course, by all the other policies we have been discussing, but I think the school play a huge role. And sometimes the experiment that Marianne was presenting in terms of the paternity leave, I think there are also experiments done in the school system about how to address the stereotypes by kids earlier on, when actually the difference can be massive in many dimensions, including violence, but also certainly also including gender balance and gender.
Yeah, I agree with all of this. I think I can't remember whether it was yesterday or the day before somebody brought up Thomas' work about how early the gender gap in maths emerge in elementary school. even kids kind of the first day of class kind of come in with the same test scores, and it's fascinating, and that, very much suggests that if you, from a long-term perspective, I think, investing in the school curriculum and trying to correct these biases, the school is going to be important. I think for a lot of countries, the issue is just more pressing. You may not have the time to wait for a generation. Like Japan, or Italy would come to mind.
If I can, I'd like to go back to the fantastic work that Marianne presented about the experiment in Japan. One of the things that struck me, I work in an international organization, 38 countries, very different. You have to learn and you have to accept. There are different ways to look at issues, and there are different policies and different, to some extent, preferences. One of the first things that struck me ages ago was that in Japan there is actually a definition for women leaving the labor market because of a child, for maternity leave, and then coming back. When they come back, they become non-regular workers. So there's even a statistics, a definition. Non-regular job means that you have a temporary contract, you don't have an open-ended contract, that you give up your career, and for the same type of job you earn in general in between 60 and 70% of what same job, open-ended contract would actually pay for. There is even in Korea exactly the same thing. So the progress that has been made in Japan on paternity leave is fantastic because they're really doing everything they can. But to some extent, these norms are so ingrained, even the statistics. So the first time I heard the non-regular work, I said, what is this? I know about, different, adjectives about a work, but not non-regular. And Korea has the same thing because it has the same problem. And it is accepted, the fact that for a woman, there is a choice. I have a child or children, actually only a child, most likely, and then I move into a non-regular employment. The same applies actually to all the workers. Because we know that actually employment rate of all the workers goes way beyond 60, but the formal open-ended job for life contract for most Japanese men and women ends at the age of 60. They might be even rehired by the same company, but with a non-regular contract. Again, part-time and fixed term. So they work much longer than 60, but with a different contract, even if they almost perform the same duty, the same task that were performing before. So these are very deeply ingrained norms in the society that, of course, policy are trying to affect. You need the employers on board, but fundamentally on board, not just on paper. And I think this is something that, Japan has been doing that for 20 years. The progress are there. Marianne showed the improvement on the paternity leave, but it's really ingrained in the society.
That is remarkable. I had no idea about that. That is extraordinary. Now, when we were talking about how early these norms are established, what is the role for policy affecting the transmission of those norms? Because a lot of it comes from parents, and there is, it's problematic for governments to intercede in how children are brought up by their parents. Schools, yes. What can norms do? What can policy do?
I mean, again, in the family, I think there's not that much that policy can really do. I think at the family level, I can think about, but children's books, textbooks have been, kind of one of the low-hanging fruit that you can, they can imagine kind of looking at. There's been some good recent work kind of really documenting, not so much, well, I think also in the context of gender, also in the context of race in the US, kind of documenting kind of what these, what is in those like very popular children's book. And, I think one of the facts from the research that I remember is that, kind of they looked at how frequently women are being depicted in these like children's book, like the most popular ones. And it's not so much that women don't show up in the pictures, but when they show up, they don't say anything. They're in the background, they don't say anything. So this is kind of a subtle thing, but I think that's kind of I think fairly low-hanging fruit to think about the kind of textbook that we use. Again, it's hard for me to talk about textbooks in the US context, where we are basically taking textbooks that kind of may feel too progressive away, right? So going in the exact opposite direction as the one that I'm suggesting would be a direction of progress.
Should we talk about the US now? Because you've mentioned it a couple of times, and I think we're overdue. How damaging do you think the policies that are being implemented now will be to gender equality?
I mean, it's a matter of, kind of how far they're going to be going.
Okay, so let me give you.
Corporation have gotten rid of their DEI, policies. I don't know how much were they exactly doing before. How much of this was just like, kind of, yeah, you know, no, we have a government that cares about women, and that cares about racial minorities, and we're going to do a lot of like, you know, belonging programming. How much of that they were actually doing, I'm not so sure. So I think it's hard for me to answer the question of like, obviously corporations are stopping doing things. I don't know how much they were really doing before and whether any of what they were doing was actually effective. So that's, you know, that's number one. I mean, I think it's certainly meaningful. I think right now, if you are a woman, and I'm going to extend that to like you are not a white man in America, and feel like, you know, people want to appreciate your contributions, and you know, and what you do, given where the cuts have been, you know, in research on these questions and all of that. So yeah, I just don't know how bad it's going to be.
Yeah, Stefano.
Well, difficult to say. I think, I mean, because we are also exploring ourselves at OECD as a member country, is actually founder member of the OECD. I think when it comes into employment of women, I don't see a particular problem. When it comes into some words which have become loaded, like equality, diversity, then of course the conversation tends to stop to some extent. So we all have to navigate that. It depends exactly. I mean, this is having an impact on the perception, on the environment in which people live. The concrete action we have to see. But of course, there's been a lot of progress also in terms of general discourse, and this is now going significantly backward. If you could go back to the point you were making before about how early we have to intervene. Let me give you one example. This is a study that you probably know. It's called the PISA, the survey on the competence of the 15 years old. There is one thing which is striking. If you ask two children, 15 years of age, about how do you see your future, okay? And they have the same score, so they actually are the same level of proficiency in literacy, numeracy, and science. Those coming from low socioeconomic background, so meaning their parents have a low level of income, see their future much worse than the others, who have middle income and then, of course, higher income. So the point I want to make here is that I think policy have to start earlier on in school, and in my view, have to target, in particular, disadvantaged groups, either because they're school where there is high level of disadvantage, where some of the parents, you cannot count on them necessarily, because they might have stereotypes or biases themselves, or they might not have time to spend with their children, or they might not have the capacity. And unfortunately, in this type of environment, this stereotype seems to actually gain roots much strongly, with all repercussion then later on. So not only intervention earlier on, I shall say, but I would say also targeted intervention.
Just add one thing. So I feel like I tried to put a few times in the lecture, but I feel like we need to also do much more research on boys right now. And that would be, I think, very helpful to the conversation. I think there are clearly like big issues happening. Certainly I know the US context pretty well, but I think you highlighted the same thing for Italy. I mean, boys are just not going to college. I mean, to the extent that we believe that college will continue to be, you know, the path to, you know, to a good job and a good career, these gender differences in college achievement and ambition for, you know, for schooling, I think really need to be addressed. And I feel like we still don't have a fairly good understanding of why boys seem to have, especially more disadvantaged boys, kind of given up on school. The old theories were essentially kind of about non-cognitive skills, you know, kind of as we are increasing kind of like the share of people going to college, there's a sicker tale of boys that may just not have the self-control to do it, you know, kind of the distribution, the bell curve is kind of more dispersed. That's kind of one theory. I think there's also things that have to do just with norms and views. So I think one hypothesis that, you know, kind of I'm trying to do some work on right now is just that the girls have done so well at school that there's a new stereotype associating schooling with girls and focusing on school as like a girl thing. So to the extent that, you know, something like that is going on, I think this needs to be addressed. So I think it would be helpful, again, thinking about the political context right now, just to as we think about, kind of equality and, to also put some more focus on trying to understand what I think is a crisis with a lot of, especially disadvantaged boys, at least in the US.
How concerned are you about the effect of the manosphere on boys?
I think I am. I have a good sense of what the content is like. I don't have a good sense of how wide the audience is. I'm going to mention my eldest daughter right now. It's going to be the first time I mention her in a conference, but she did a high school project, on the manosphere. She spent a month studying the manosphere, so I know more about the manosphere than I probably should.
Than you really want to. Yeah.
One part of the project was like, how difficult is it, say you're on Twitter, to end up in some of these forums? You say that you like, Elon Musk and you like finance, and you are getting pushed some of that content immediately. So I'm guessing that exposure to this content is quite widespread. And again, it's just like the issue of like, kind of marriages, kind of these educational imbalances at some point are going to create some, as already doing, creating pressures on, on marriage and all of that. So we should talk more about boys, is what I'm saying.
Stefano?
Well, thinking something about the point about the possible impact of the US new policy, given the fact that dominate also on the digital technology and artificial intelligence. I think one challenge is, but at the same time, one opportunity is also how generative AI is going to be used. I'll give you just one example because you came across that. I think all of us have seen biases and also hallucinations. So another major survey of the OECD is on the adult scale. This was launched in December. Report 250 pages. There is one of these algorithms that take whatever document, even some of these econometric papers that have been discussed today, and turn it into a podcast, 15-minute podcast. So we actually tested. So we do 250 pages, boom, and you got a podcast of 15 minutes. That was fantastic. All the key messages were there. Two problems. First, guess who was the one asking the question? Okay. The female voice. A little bit light. So, oh yeah, wonderful, so cool. Tell me more about it. The person answering the question was a man with a voice a bit deeper and providing, So we said, no, sorry, turn it around. We want actually the question be posed by a man and the answer by a woman. And the algorithm did it for us. Problem is that the question became much more articulated and the answer became a little bit lighter. So again, these tools are used by everyone, and this unfortunately is a way to actually, to some extent, spread over biases, unconscious or conscious biases, to a very significant extent. So to the extent to which those who design this algorithm are in one country, that is to some extent now embedded into this new way of thinking about diversity, equality, and so on, I'm afraid there's a concern I have that some of these algorithms might be less sensitive to these even obvious biases like the gender biases.
I think because there were probably some questions left over when Marianne finished as well. Should we ask some questions, get some questions from the audience right now? And yes, there's one over there. And we took the microphones.
Yeah, fantastic lecture and discussion. Just one simple question about your Japanese study is whether you can see if there is a leading by example effect, meaning if in firms where CEOs or top managers actually took a maternity leave, if this had an effect maybe larger than the video itself.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think one of the downsides of Japan is I don't think there's the kind of data to do that, but you could do it in France.
It was working a minute ago.
Anyway, if it wouldn't work, I would shout. So thanks a lot. Super interesting. I have one issue which I would love you to reflect on. To what extent you think that there is a real concern about backlash to the progressive policies, both in the US but also in Europe? So we've seen, these gaps increasing now, and how much of it is just because we've been not careful in introducing these policies, which are very important. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm certainly. Would you want to
No,
start?
go ahead.
I'm certainly kind of worried about about backlash, and it's hard for me to rule out the possibility that part of what's happening right now, right, again, kind of US is top of mind, is a little bit of, is a little bit of backlash. I mean, about gender, about, progress of other kind of minority groups, in the US, within this kind of like zero-sum thinking about when I see some groups that are not as progressing, that means that, they're taking stuff away from us. I think, so yes, I'm definitely very worried about it.
Stefano?
No, I think we all share these, only time will tell us. Interesting enough, at OECD we see actually a number of countries wanting us to continue to do the work we have been doing, not just on gender, but on LGBTI, on all the minority, on migration, and so on and so forth. It's going to be a difficult environment, and there would be more tension among member countries and internationally. We see that. I think some of the progress are deeply rooted today, but of course it might be sort of a blip, and then hopefully we will go back to the trend we have been seeing with difficulty. I can tell you that's an example is that 10 years ago, in 2015, the G20 countries agree on a target to reduce the gender gap in labor force participation by 25% by 2025, so this year. And this, for example, means in a country like India that they have to basically create 90 million jobs for women, so it's not a small target. Many countries have achieved that, others were lagging behind. Well, the discussion this year about renewing this important target has been a little bit more nuanced, I shall say. So what will probably come up is something which was not as ambitious as it was 10 years ago. We would have actually helped, but it was the opposite. So we actually now, since it is work out, we have to be even more ambitious. In fact, we actually sort of stepping back with something which is a little bit lighter in terms of ambition.
That is a shame. I think it's very interesting how DEI policies now are being framed by those who object to them as unfair. And that's kind of like strange probably for everyone in this room.
Well, I mean, I'm reminded of like Swan's paper earlier today, right? That's kind of was the spirit of maybe pushing a little bit of our findings. So you have like a policy, reservation policy with good jobs that pay very well, and just women can access these jobs. If that's how people are perceiving what DEI was all about, they might not be happy about it. So it's also, I mean, a question of understanding what is meant by diversity and belonging and inclusion. I mean, it's hard to understand why these have become dirty. It's hard to understand why these have become dirty words. Yeah,
but
especially the D and I.
Yes, absolutely.
Hi. One paradox in the case of Japan is that it's a policy meant to share the workload better in the household, but at the end of the day, it's the men who exercise the options whether to take or not the paternity leave. So are there other options, maybe more cost effective, so that women actually choose between options such as paternity leave or getting the cash equivalent or any other policy? Are there countries where there are like options but given to women to actually share the workload better?
Well, I think when there was a sort of the parental leave, before actually some of this parental leave has to be taken by the man, the father. Basically, the parental leave was taken largely by the women. So it was only then some countries said, well, no, this is a parental leave, this is the maximum, but part of it is actually only for the father. And then you see some adjustment to that. I think the default option is that the mother is the one stay home to take care of the child or the children. And therefore, you focus on the father as the variable that can actually adjust and therefore give the opportunity to the woman, to the mother to come back into the labor market earlier on. The interesting thing about Japan is that's very generous because basically it's 52 weeks. So for the first year, guess what? That's exactly the time when the mother can take the maternity leave. So to some extent, in the early days of a child, well, maybe it's the mother stays home. And the fact that this paternity leave is available only in the first year makes it to some extent that either the two parents stay home or actually it's the mother that takes most of it, and then the father has only. So what we've been recommending to Japan is to extend this paternity leave beyond the first year, so that maybe at some point is the mother going back to work and the father taking care of the child. Because the fact is on the same year actually makes it to some extent even difficult for the father to leave, to stay home and take care of the child.
We have a question here and then one in front there. Yes, exactly.
Can you hear me?
There's definitely one button that works, but I don't know which one it is.
Okay, now it should be working.
Now it works.
Thank you for the lecture and for the discussion. I wanted to go back a bit to this point on gender polarization. You mentioned social media, also backlash, but I would like to hear your views on to what extent maybe broader rising economic inequality and precarious jobs, maybe even interfering with masculinity norms of the provider role, even with lower boys' education. So to what extent these more economic phenomena might be intersecting with this gender polarization?
I think these are all great questions, and I don't feel like, certainly I'm not aware of, kind of the research that would allow me to pinpoint kind of where exactly, it's coming from. I highlighted social media because I think it's an important force, but I don't know kind of quantitatively how big of it is. But when you talk about, the precarious work, you talk about the difference in education. I tend to think about the education as being kind of an outcome that is driven by the norms, but you want to flip it around, totally valid and worth thinking about as well. So I don't know. It's, I think, a great area to do some research on right now.
Maybe one additional point, of course, we know that there is a significant segregation in terms of also job quality, right? So women take 70% of part-time employment, a much higher share of temporary contracts. An interesting point that we observed in the past few years, because of this widespread labor shortage, is that employers now trying to offer more open-ended contract and more full-time jobs to men and to women. So we see to some extent the gender gap in job quality along the dimension for which we have the data to some extent to be reduced. Now, to the extent to which this is not just a cyclical phenomenon, but is actually a signal of the fact that we are entering into a new era where actually we are not going to have a shortage of jobs, but rather a shortage of workers, of labor, then to some extent employers are adjusting and they have to offer better working conditions, including for women, of course, that are either already into the labor market or for whom it is possible to work more out. Now, when we look at part-time employment, we have to be careful, of course, because this might be considered to be voluntary, but just because of the issue we have been discussing, because that woman might have to take care of the child or children. So we have to take that into account, which brings back to the policy about parental leave and also paternity leave. But I think almost implicitly, because of demographic changes, the impact on the labor market, the demand for labor is changing to some extent and is reducing some of the very structural inequality we have been seeing for decades, I would say.
If you pass down 2 rows forward, 3 rows forward, I think. There we go. Thank you. Have a go.
Every time we switch over.
Can't hear you
I'm happy
now.
to see I'm not the only one to have problems with the technology.
I think, I didn't break
that works.
it. Okay. So I have 2 questions, 1 question each for you. And to go back to your study on Japan, I was just curious, like, if you have a chance to see, like, fathers who had a children before that, like, Japanese government actively implemented policy, and another one after that policy implemented. I was curious if you have data on that.
In terms of like kind of heterogeneity of effects based on that,
Yes.
we have not looked at that, but we can because we know whether they have had children before.
Yeah, I was curious to take a rate for that. And another question is, alongside Japan, you talked a lot about Korea, and as a Korean, I was just curious because Korean government spent a lot of money on generous parental leave and subsidies for like newly married couple and like for children as well. But we can still see like Korean's birth rate is very much downward facing. It's one of the, I think it's the lowest among OECD countries. And in your opinion, what is the Korean government missing in that 10, 15 years they're spending a lot of money?
very difficult question to answer. I think the fertility rate in Korea is 0.79, so the lowest we have in the OECD countries. And reverting that is going to be very, very difficult. Korea is also the country with the highest rate of tertiary graduate among young men and young women, so it's investing a lot on human capital. The problem there is perhaps that there is a bit of a mismatch between the level of studies and the type of studies and then what the labor market actually demands. So this creates other issues about the mismatches in between education and skills and actually what people do on the job. And I think Korea has been really ahead also in trying to reduce some of the inequalities. One best example is that it's now thinking, I mean, of course, a one-child policy means that you do everything for your child. Your child has to go to an academic kind of line of study. I mean, the idea of technical vocational education was really not, correct me if I'm wrong, in the mind of most parents. Now they're investing a lot in high-quality technical vocational education, difficult to put in place and to revert that mentality when for your own child, you want to do actually the best and therefore they have to go to a college. The way they do it, actually, they bring some of the best teachers and some of the best employers to be the teacher in this technical vocational education. Because that's a way to revert some of the norm in countries like Germany, Austria, the Nordic countries. Actually, technical vocational education is something which is absolutely not considered to be second class to more academic studies. It's very difficult in a country like Korea, but the government is doing really a lot to try to change this attitude and these approaches.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. Before you pass the microphone on, I'd like to ask your opinion about Korean society. Not that one.
Well, I think technology is not super working, but okay. Okay. Thank you.
Hold it.
Yeah.
So I think it's as you mentioned, it's a very hard question to tackle. But I think one of the problem is competitiveness in Korea in general, because as a Korean, I mean, also you're likely to have one or two children in a family, and you have a lot of expectation from your family that because they invest on you a lot. And as a Korea, like we had a lot of succeed through the education. We like. In such a short time of period after the Korean War finished, we made a remarkable economic success through the education and also people basically human capital. But I think now because of that, people invest still a lot for education because we still believe that's one of the way you succeed in the society, and you spend a lot on your children, and it becomes more competitive because everyone spends on your children. So I think one of the way is. Diversify the labor, jobs that people can take, because one of the best job as a Korean you can think is going to Samsung or LG, or Hyundai. So there's very limited profile that we can work on. And to get into that job market, you have to go to a certain school, top schools. And to get in there, you have a SAT to take and many other things to do. So I think how the government can tackle the competitiveness and how to diversify the job market can be one of the problems that they should prioritize, in my opinion. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Consistent with what you said, right?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. We really appreciate it. Other questions? There's one question down here in the front. Don't throw it. Thank you.
So I was hoping you might be able to talk a little bit about the demographic transition and how this might affect the gender gap. There's been concerns about care for elderly parents and thinking a little bit about this. So how are you guys thinking about this? What are we doing? How can we address this better, especially because, women are already working in these sectors a lot?
Yeah, but I'll say the obvious, you take the harder part. I mean, I think certainly kind of the growth in the demand for jobs in elderly care, and some of them will be in home situations. A lot of them would be kind of in the marketplace, will lead to a further increase in the number of jobs in the healthcare sector, which kind of raises this other difficulty, right? Going back to kind of where's the growth in jobs, that's a big one. Besides becoming a doctor, boys are not, or men are not super interested in those jobs. That's another form of stereotypes, kind of how do we get more men to see that these are kind of good careers that are not in contradiction with, kind of their self-views. I think is super important. There's been some work, I forgot the name, but like people have been working on trying to change men's views about kind of working in pink jobs. But yeah, the number of those jobs that have been kind of signed as kind of female jobs, I think is gonna increase the function of that.
Mm-hmm. Stefano?
That's a very good question. I think about the future in which there would be fewer children, so less need for women to stay home to childcare, but more elderly, and therefore more demand for long-term care. Now, I'm not sure whether men consider themselves better suited for taking care of children or taking care of the elderly. I don't think there's much of a difference there. So the potential is that we are switching from one type of care to another type of care, and still this sort of pressure for women not to actually be in the labor market. Problem is, at the same time, we desperately need all the talents we have. In France, the situation is somewhat better in a number of other Southern European countries, but not that much better. So we need to make sure that all the talent pool we have out there, including many women who are highly educated, actually can make a contribution. Otherwise, we would have to live in a situation which our living standards stagnate, and in some cases, actually, we start deteriorating significantly, with all the implication in terms of further inequalities, because this will not be shared equally across the board. So again, it's a question of how we share basically unpaid work and how we actually move from basically promoting a role for fathers into taking care of the children, of making sure that the father actually take care of the elderly. And again, this is another battle we have to fight, in my view, because the perception is still that women are better at taking care of the elderly, which again, we have to dispel this stereotype.
Just add one quick thing. So whatever research I've seen on like the labor market cost for women of like, kind of elderly care. So like people have done some event studies, you're the parent kind of has a fall and is now kind of, staying at home, is not found, again, overall, I think kind of large negative labor market effects, for women. I think a big part of it is that typically that kind of care happens later on in your career, right? Once you've already kind of maybe plateaued. So the fact that you are, off the workforce, kind of at a time where you're making a lot of investments, which is typically kind of when you are younger and being a mother, that's costly. If you're out of the labor force, kind of when, your income is more plateaued, then the disruptions, the labor market disruptions are not as large.
However, I would argue that, the issue we are facing is also that we need all the talents, including all the women participating in the labor market. With a change in the family composition, we need to make sure that women also contribute to their own pension system. So if at some point women will not be in the early phases when they leave the labor market because of taking care of the child or children, but later on because they have to take care of the parents, this might actually reduce their ability to continue to contribute to the pension system, with potential implication for, again, the level of income when they move into retirement. So I fully agree with Marianne, the issue is somewhat different, but I think there is also that element we have to take into account.
Yeah. Excellent. Do we have any other questions? Yes. The microphone's got some way to travel. Handle it carefully.
Thank you for a wonderful hour of lecture and discussion. So I'm a PhD student from Australia, and we have been declining on gender equality indicators, but we have fairly good institutions in place. And also,
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
And my own research kind of runs into the gender equality paradox, where some gender differences apparently are larger in more developed countries like Australia. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, and do you have any implications for Australia? Less relevant at this conference.
I don't know anything about Australia. So I think the research that you alluded to, and all the people are familiar with it, it's kind of it's called the gender equality paradox research, which essentially kind of tends to show that if you, let's take Sweden, right, kind of look at the countries that are kind of more gender equal based on, standard indices. If anything, the gender gaps in nursing is even larger there. So women seem to be going, this research claims, towards kind of the stereotypically female kind of profession. And this has been kind of read as evidence of, well, you free women up, now they are revealing their true preferences. Their preferences is to do, to do the pink jobs. So my reading, and I must say, I'm just starting to dig into, into these papers for a handbook thing I have to write, is that if you look at the patterns in levels rather than in first differences, they don't match the narrative. So essentially, in Sweden, there's an increase in the amount of men and women that are going into nursing. The slope, so it's not like it's just the slope is a little higher for women than it is for men, right? So, I think people are looking at this research and basically saying, the more gender equal the place, the less women do math, the more they do nursing. That's not what, kind of the story is really is when you look at the trends by gender rather than just looking at the gender gaps. But again, I'm just starting to dig into this work.
That's good advice, Stefano.
Well, not much to add apart from the fact that the target I mentioned before, 25 by 25, was actually set up in Brisbane. So definitely Australia pushed for that and actually was instrumental to get through this important target for all G20 countries. But I think I also agree with Marianne. When you reach certain plateau in terms of gender equality, then looking at variation at that plateau, we have to be interpreted very carefully, because I think then you look at a number of other factors. I think, again, if we look at G20 countries or even the OECD countries, much progress we have to make to reach to the situation we find in Australia. So there is certainly progress to be made.
Now, if we have any other questions, we have probably time for one more person to battle the microphone, if they want to, if they dare. But if not, excellent. Then, in which case, I think we've used up our time extremely well. That was great, wasn't it? So please thank the panel. Yeah. Thank you for all of you for your attendance. We hope that you've had a good time and that you found something that you're interested in. I would be surprised if you haven't. That's the end of our forum. Thank you.